February 1429. An English army is about to starve, but their salvation comes in 300 wagons of fish. This is the story of how a battle over salted herrings almost destroyed a nation, and how 1,500 men turned their supply train into a fortress against an army 4 times their size. At their head was Sir John Fastolf, a battle-hardened veteran given a strange and dangerous mission. He was not a man of grand chivalric gestures. He was a product of the long, grinding war, a pragmatist who understood that victory was forged in logistics and discipline, not in reckless charges. For decades, England's armies, powered by their terrifying longbowmen, had crushed the nobility of France, leaving the kingdom fractured and on the brink of total collapse. Now, the great city of Orléans on the Loire River was the final domino left to fall. An English army surrounded it, slowly strangling it into submission in a ring of newly built fortresses. But that army, a massive logistical undertaking in hostile territory, was now running low on food. Its survival depended on Fastolf. His convoy was the lifeblood of the siege. 300 heavy wagons, groaning under the weight of crossbow bolts, cannonballs, and, most famously, an enormous quantity of salted herrings to feed the thousands of soldiers through the long, arduous fast of Lent. His escort was dangerously small for such a valuable prize. Just 500 of his elite longbowmen, the masters of the European battlefield, and around 1,000 Parisian militiamen, soldiers of questionable quality, whose loyalty was as thin as their winter cloaks. Fastolf was under no illusions. He was marching deep into a hostile land, a conspicuous and vulnerable target. His mind was not on glory, but on the 100 different ways his column could be ambushed and destroyed. For the men guarding the convoy, the mission was grimly ironic: march hundreds of miles through enemy territory, risking their lives at every turn, all so their comrades could properly observe their Lenten fast. This clash, born of desperation and logistics, would be decided in the frozen mud of the Loire Valley. And Fastolf had no idea that a force of nearly 4,000 men, led by France's royal cousin and the Constable of Scotland, was already gathering just ahead, waiting for him. The convoy creaked forward, a slow serpent of wood and iron cutting through the frost-bitten landscape. The journey was a grueling ordeal. The roads were little more than frozen, rutted tracks, and the heavy wagons frequently bogged down in the mud and ice, their great wheels churning the earth into a thick, viscous slurry. The pace was agonizingly slow, dictated by the speed of the oxen that strained against their yokes, their breath pluming in the frigid air. A biting wind swept across the desolate plains of the Beauce region, chilling the men to the bone. The landscape itself felt hostile, a patchwork of skeletal forests and fallow fields, dotted with villages whose inhabitants watched the English column pass with sullen, hateful eyes. Every tree line could hide an ambush. Every distant rider could be an enemy scout. The heart and soul of Fastolf's meager force were his longbowmen. These were men who had been born into the art of war, required by royal decree to practice with the massive yew longbow from boyhood. The physical toll of this training was immense, visibly reshaping their skeletons, broadening their shoulders and curving their spines. But it created the most lethal infantryman of the era, a soldier capable of shooting up to 12 armor-piercing arrows a minute, creating a storm of steel that could decimate enemy formations from over 200 yards away. They marched with a quiet, grim professionalism, their faces weathered by countless campaigns, their movements economical and sure. They trusted their weapon, their comrades, and the dour, cautious general who led them. The Parisian militia, however, was another story. They were less disciplined, more prone to complaint, and their presence was a constant source of anxiety for Fastolf. His discipline was iron. The column marched in a tight, organized block, with his outriders constantly testing the route ahead. At night, the camp was a fortress. The wagons were drawn into a defensive circle, a laager, creating a ready-made barricade. Pickets were posted, and no man was allowed to sleep without his weapon at his side. He was a constant presence, his mind ceaselessly calculating odds and planning for the worst. But even he couldn't plan for the argument that was about to break out between the two enemy commanders, an argument that would seal his fate. As the days wore on, The reports from the scouts grew more and more ominous. The enemy was no longer a shadow, but a gathering storm. What had started as scattered bands of partisans had coalesced into a real army, a force of French knights and, more worryingly, elite Scottish professionals. They were shadowing the convoy, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Fastolf knew that his hopes of slipping through to Orléans were gone. The enemy had chosen their ground. He was no longer just a quartermaster leading a convoy. He was a general preparing his men for a battle they were never supposed to fight, and for which they were horribly outnumbered. The warning came not as a trumpet call, but as a flicker of movement in the trees, followed by the frantic cry of a single scout. In an instant, the cold, monotonous quiet of the march shatters. The hunters have found their prey. On the morning of February 12th, on an open plain near the village of Rouvray, the Franco-Scottish army appeared. They were not an approaching column, they were a deployed battle line, a massive, terrifying wall of men and steel that seemed to cover the earth. The sun glinted off thousands of helmeted heads, lance points, and the polished armor of the French knights. Banners snapped in the wind, the royal fleur-de-lis of France and the rampant lion of Scotland. The sheer scale of the force, nearly 4,000 strong against 1,500, was designed to inspire terror, and it succeeded. A wave of panic rippled through the English ranks. The Parisian militia, their courage evaporating, began to look over their shoulders, their formation wavering. The entire convoy was on the verge of disintegrating into a panicked rout. It would have been a massacre, if not for Fastolf's next, insane command. In that moment of supreme chaos, his voice rang out, a harsh, steady bellow that cut through the fear. Lager, form the lager. It was an order his veterans understood instantly. Chaos transformed into disciplined, furious activity. The wagon drivers expertly wheeled their carts into a tight circle, hub to hub, creating a solid wooden wall. The horses and oxen were driven into the protected space at the center. It was a race against time as the French and Scottish army began its slow, deliberate advance. As the circle closed, the longbowmen hammered their sharpened stakes into the frozen earth, angling them outwards to create a vicious, impenetrable hedge. Gaps between the wagons were filled with barrels of supplies, arrows, tools, and the now famous herrings. In less than 15 minutes, a vulnerable marching column had transformed itself into a small, defiant fortress. From a low rise half a mile away, the French commander, the Count of Clermont, and his Scottish counterpart, John Stuart of Darnley, watched this transformation with arrogant disbelief. They had their enemy trapped, but the appearance of the makeshift fort sparked a heated argument that would prove fatal. Stuart, embodying the fiery spirit of the Scots, demanded an immediate, all-out infantry assault. He had nothing but contempt for archers behind a barricade and believed his men could storm it through sheer ferocity. Clermont, however, favored a more modern approach. He had several cannons and wanted to use them to methodically smash holes in the wagon wall, believing it foolish to waste his men in a premature charge. The argument exposed the fatal flaw in their command, a clash of tactics and a clash of egos. They settled on a disastrous compromise. Clermont would begin with a short artillery bombardment, after which Stuart would lead the main charge. That delay, born of indecision and pride, gave Fastolf and his men the precious minutes they needed to perfect their defenses. The trap had been sprung, but in doing so, the hunters had allowed their prey to build a den, and now they would have to tear it apart with their bare hands. The French cannons roar. The first volley of an iron storm meant to blast the makeshift fortress apart. But from behind the splintering wagons, an answer comes not of thunder, but a sharp, terrifying hum, as hundreds of bowstrings are loosed in perfect unison. Clermont's artillery opened the battle. These were crude, temperamental beasts, constructed from iron hoops bound together like barrels, and their accuracy was abysmal. Yet their psychological effect was undeniable. The ground shook with each deafening discharge, and the air filled with acrid black smoke. Stone projectiles hurtled towards the English position. Most ploughed harmlessly into the frozen earth, but some found their mark, smashing into the wagons with terrifying force. Oak beams splintered like matchsticks. A wagon loaded with barrels of herrings took a direct hit and exploded in a shower of wood and salted fish. The English defenders pressed themselves against their barricades, heads down, enduring the barrage with stoic resolve. They were shaken but largely unharmed. The wagon wall, reinforced with its cargo, proved to be a surprisingly effective shield, absorbing the kinetic energy of the cannonballs. Watching from the French lines, John Stuart of Darnley fumed with impatience. This slow, impersonal bombardment was anathema to the Scottish way of war, which prized the ferocious shock of a massed infantry charge. Seeing the minimal effect of the cannons, he could wait no longer. He formed his Scottish contingent, some 600 strong, into a dense column, a skiltron of pikes and axes. With a great roar, they began their advance across the frozen plain. It was a sight to behold, a wave of disciplined, hardened warriors, the elite of the French army, moving with a single purpose. They were confident, utterly convinced that they would sweep over the pathetic English barricade and put every man to the sword. Inside the laager, Sir John Fastolf watched their inexorable approach. He remained motionless, a picture of calm control. His longbowmen were arrayed along the perimeter, 3 ranks deep, arrows resting on the string, waiting. The air grew thick with a tense silence, broken only by the crunch of Scottish boots on the icy ground and the flutter of their banners. Fastolf let them come, 250 yards, 200 yards. He waited until he could see the grit and determination in their eyes. Then, he raised his hand and dropped it. The command rippled down the English line. In perfect unison, the front rank of archers drew their bows to their ears, held for a heartbeat, and released. The sound was a physical thing, a deep, sharp hum that vibrated through the air. Hundreds of arrows leaped into the sky, climbing in a high arc before plunging almost vertically into the heart of the Scottish formation. The effect was sickeningly effective. The bodkin-tipped arrows, weighing several ounces and falling with the force of gravity, punched through helmets and shoulder plates as if they were made of parchment. Men screamed and collapsed. Before the first volley had even completed its deadly work, the second rank of archers had loosed, and then the third. It was not a single volley. It was a continuous, rolling storm of steel. The disciplined Scottish advance faltered, the men instinctively raising their shields, but the arrows came from above, finding the gaps in their armor. The charge lost its momentum, devolving into a bloody crawl. John Stuart of Darnley, leading from the front as was his custom, was struck down, an English arrow piercing his visor. His death was the final blow. The heart went out of the Scottish attack. Their glorious charge had bled out in the frozen mud, hundreds of yards from the English line. The greatest charge had shattered against a wall of wood and a storm of steel, and the unlikeliest of fortresses had held. But survival was not victory, and the battle was not yet over. There is a moment when a charge breaks. Not all at once, but in dozens of small decisions a man falters, another turns, and suddenly the roar of attack becomes a scramble of panicked retreat. The great army was no longer an army, but a mob, and the scent of fear was thicker than the smell of fish. The annihilation of the Scottish vanguard sent a shockwave of horror through the rest of the French army. The Count of Clermont, seeing his battle plan in tatters, desperately tried to regain control, ordering his own men-at-arms and knights to advance. But the attack was now disjointed and demoralized. Some charged on horseback, hoping their heavy armor and powerful steeds could break through where the Scots had failed. They were met with disaster. The horses, galloping at full tilt, ran headlong into the unseen hedge of sharpened stakes. The results were horrific. Horses were impaled, screaming in agony, throwing their riders to the ground. These knights, encased in 50 to 60 pounds of steel plate, were nearly helpless once dismounted, and were systematically picked off by the English archers. Other French units advanced on foot, but their charge lacked the conviction and ferocity of the Scots. They were met with the same terrifying arrow storm and faltered long before reaching the wagons. The entire Franco-Scottish army was now a confused, wavering mass, its command structure decapitated, its morale shattered. The will to fight simply evaporated. Sir John Fastolf, watching from the relative safety of his wagon fort, saw the decisive moment. A victory was not complete until the enemy was pursued. He ordered a section of the wagons moved aside, creating a sally port. Through this gap, he unleashed his own small contingent of mounted men-at-arms. They thundered out onto the plain and ploughed into the flank of the fleeing French. At the same time, a large number of his longbowmen emerged from the larger, advancing in disciplined ranks, continuing to fire volley after volley into the backs of the retreating soldiers. The rout turned into a slaughter. The English were merciless, cutting down the stragglers, taking valuable nobles prisoner for ransom, and completely scattering the remnants of the enemy force. As dusk began to fall, the sounds of battle finally died away. The plain of Rouvray was a grim tableau littered with the bodies of over 400 French and Scottish soldiers. The snow-dusted ground was stained dark with blood and littered with discarded weapons, armor, and the pathetic, scattered remains of burst barrels of herrings. Fastolf's losses were astoundingly light by some accounts, fewer than 10 men. It was a victory of almost unbelievable proportions. Every great story has its turning point, and we love to explore them. If you have a favorite battle you think deserves this kind of deep dive, let us know in the comments below. And don't forget to share this story with anyone who loves a tale of impossible odds. The battle was won. Fastolf delivered his herrings. The English at Orléans celebrated a victory that seemed to seal France's doom. They proved that even a supply convoy, defended with discipline and stakes, could crush a vastly superior army. It was a perfect victory. And it would be the last great victory the English would win in the 100 Years' War. Because this humiliating defeat, this battle over fish, would directly lead to the rise of an illiterate farm girl who would burn with holy fire, crown a king, and change the course of history forever. To see the incredible story of Joan of Arc and how she rose from these ashes, make sure you subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss our next chapter. Thank you for joining us on this journey into the past. The Battle of the Herrings is a powerful reminder that history is often made in the most unexpected of places by the most unlikely of heroes. If you want to see more stories about the incredible battles and forgotten figures that shaped our world, make sure to turn on notifications. We'll see you next time.